Hello dear viewers, I'm George from Ireland. Here I am at the Republican plot in Glasnevin Cemetery, Dublin. It's my first visit since I was 18, and that's more than a year ago, I'll put it like that. So by Republican, obviously that means people who are part of a certain movement, a political and national movement. And what they wanted to do was to sunder Ireland from Great Britain, so it split away from the United Kingdom, and they call themselves Republicans because what's the first thing everyone knows about the UK? Well, that there is a queen, or as in the old days, as a king. Now, being a monarchy was unremarkable in the 19th century, though by the 20th century it's unusual. So partly they're anti-monarchists, but they're also ultra-nationalists, xenophobic too. Although, what was it about? They say that they're non-sectarian, it's open to Protestants as well as Catholics. Obviously, there were plenty of Protestants in the Republican movement. We go back into the 18th century, into the 19th century, often the leaders. And the Republicans often say, oh, it's bad that Protestants have the top jobs in society. Well, how come it's not bad that they have most of the top jobs in the United Irishmen and subsequent Republican movements? By the 20th century, it was an overwhelmingly Catholic thing, and indeed quite often anti-Protestant. So some of the luminaries of republicanism. Here is Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosser. Now, O'Donovan is a surname. The Rosser bit is because he comes from Ross Carberry. It's hotly debated whether he actually comes from a nearby town. So he spent his last few decades in the United States. He died in 1915, and his body was then returned to Ireland to be interred here. Patrick Henry Pearce famously gave an oration at this spot when the man's carcass was lowered into the soil, and he says, the fools, the fools, the fools, they've left us our Fenian dead. Ireland unfree shall never be at peace, which is of course complete twaddle, because we were a very free country as it was, and we're at peace now. From a Republican perspective, we're not free now because 6 counties are part of the United Kingdom by the express wish of a high majority of Irish people. 85% of people voted on that referendum for the Good Friday Agreement, voted that Northern Ireland is part of the UK. The whole of Ireland got to vote on the same day on that issue, and in those who voted against were mostly Unionists. So the partition is stratospherically popular. So anyway, he was dead wrong. Anyway, they've left us our Fenian dead. I don't quite understand. So if they hadn't given the corpse back, then the Union would have been safe. That wouldn't make sense either. Supposing the government hadn't allowed this guy's body to come back, would the Irish Republican Brotherhood not have attempted an insurrection? I think they would have. Oh yeah, so here is the O'Rahilly. So Alfred O'Rahilly, known as the O'Rahilly, because he was a hereditary clan chieftain. Not that we recognise these things by the 20th century, but was he really? Because the Flight of the Earl, 1607, most of our chiefs moved overseas. They moved to Spain, France, Germany, the Papal States, and so on. But it surely goes against the egalitarian spirit of the Republicans. Anyway, so he was part of the IRB. He'd heard the order to cancel the Easter Rising. He drove around, Dublin city and county, cancelling it because the arms hadn't come from Germany. Then it was uncancelled, and he said, "Well, I've wound the clock. I'm come to make it ring." He decided to fight anyway, and he was fatally wounded. And a breakout from the GPO towards the end managed to scribble a note before he died of exsanguination. Anyway, he lies here. He's a Kerryman. And it mentions various other people. Sometimes they're just for having married whoever. Thomas MacDonald's wife. Who else mentions these? So the Connacht Rangers, an Irish regiment of the British Army serving in India. When we're helping them become emancipated, greater women's rights, better education, better health care, better agricultural methods, keeping peace between the different ethnic groups, religions of India, defending India from Afghanistan and so on. That's what these men were doing. But anyway, some of them committed the supreme military crime of mutiny, and 2 of them were killed in the process. One of them was executed subsequently. Those of the others got some terms of imprisonment. So just how glorious and merciful the Crown was, because they all could have been put to death, but only a small number of them were executed. Same after the Easter Rising, roughly 1,000 people involved in that, men in court-martialed, only about 97 sentenced to death, and only 15 of those executed. Roger Casement's different. He's the 16th, executed for something else, but for treason, trying to bring the guns in, not for the actual rising. And so they're very, very lenient. Every single one of them could have been put to death. I'm not in favour of capital punishment, but it wasn't controversial over 100 years ago, and was used promiscuously, very promiscuously in many countries at the time. So compared to other insurrections, the way the United Kingdom dealt with it was very mild indeed, and there's no recognition of that. There's no gratitude for the clemency that was shown, and these guys who had their lives spared were even released within a year. And what did they do? Showed no thanks for the fact that they were given their lives. They went on to start an insurrection a year again, killing lots of Irish people. And so, you know, Easter Rising, over a century later, for some people it's still not over. So they've got a lot to answer for. Think how they've immiserated Ireland. Various people who died on hunger strike. It mentions Thomas Ashe, first of all, who actually didn't die from hunger strike. He died from attempt to feed him. So anyway, why would people mourn him? Because he got what he wanted. He wanted to die, and he did. And what were the authorities guilty of? Trying to save his life? Anyway, so it mentioned various other people who died on hunger strike. You see the guys who died in 1923, 3 of them, 1940, 2 of them, 1946, 1 of them. They all died on hunger strike against the independent Irish government, the Irish Free State. So it mentions more John Devoy, who was in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, moved to the United States, spent decades there, published in the Gaelic American, head of Clan na Gael, some sort of pro-IRA organization in the United States. Anyway, so then we got more of the Republican plot and various people buried here, some of whom you wouldn't have heard of. Remember when I came here first time, Bertie Ahern's mother had just been buried because his father lies interred here. Not that his father was actually particularly important in the IRA. And you can still see the mound. Oh, it's over there, Julia Ahern. So anyone else I particularly want to talk about? I'm just seeing here. I don't think so. Most of the names I simply don't recognise. People killed in the 1920s mostly, and in the Civil War, as in they were against democracy. They were against the elected Irish government. Some people who were killed in the Easter Rising. And then we've got Harry Boland, who was killed in an attempted arrest in 1922 in the Civil War. His brother Gerald Boland, who lived on for decades, being minister of various things. He also interred other IRA men much later on. They used to call the lavatory Bolands in the Curragh internment camp. Countess Markovich just here. I mean, there's no point in seeing it because there's just the name, there's just grass. So that woman who came from an upper class Protestant family, converted to Catholicism, and wore trousers in the Easter Rising, physically fought, shot at soldiers and police officers. So she was sentenced to death but spared on account of her sex. And she died in 1926, because we're often told, oh, Protestants can be Republicans too, but quite often they convert to Catholicism, and she would be a case in point. And then it's got Cathal Brugh. Now, Charles Burgess and Cathal Brugh may not sound the same, but Charles Burgess is the blighter's proper name. So he was born to a Protestant father and a Catholic mother, but he was brought up as a Catholic, and he was in the Easter Rising. I think so badly wounded he wasn't suspected to survive, but so they didn't execute him. Well, what a pity they didn't. Actually would have saved a lot of misery later on, and he clearly wanted to die, so he lived on. And then in the Civil War he was against the legitimate Irish government, and they said Easter week repeats itself. That's what the pro-IRA posters said. And then some of his men were just off O'Connell Street. They took over a hotel, was it Gresham's Hotel, and they told the others to go out and surrender, and he came out all guns blazing at the Free State Army, who shot him. Artery was severed. He died 2 days later, and that's him. Anyway, so various other people. There's plenty more space in case the conflict would break out anew, but some of these old timers were buried decades after the fighting. Don't imagine most people buried here were actually killed in fighting. And it's got various people here who were executed by firing squad. Yeah, Richard Tuig, James Fisher, and so on. So the Civil War got fairly nasty. The Free State government said, okay, anyone you're taking under arms can be executed. We're a legitimate government. You're not wearing uniform. You're outside the Geneva Convention. So they caught 4 young men, mostly 18 years old, and they executed them by firing squad. And they did it almost at random. They said, if we executed someone who's very senior in the IRA might imagine, okay, well, I'm not high up in the IRA, I'm not going to be put to death. No, you can be. They also, I can't remember who was assassinated. It was a TD, Teocht Dóla, as an MP. And so the government simply ordered 4 prisoners to be executed, senior men, 1 from Munster, 1 from Leinster, and 1 from Connacht. So Liam Mellows from Connacht, Joe McKelvey from Belfast. Who was the Munster guy? I can't remember. Oh yeah, Richard Barrett, and then the guy from Leinster. Who was that? Was that Rory O'Connor? Same as the name as the one of the last High Kings of Ireland. He was executed, and here's Rory O'Connor. Four Great Names was the poem that Brendan Behan wrote about them when he was 15. So we're almost at the end of the Republican plot. There's nobody buried in the rest of it, and there are various people here. I mean, they're all nobodies so far as I'm concerned. Various people involved in the Republican movement, apart from, let me see, is that it? Oh yeah, it did say there was Daithí O'Connell, as in David O'Connell. I think it was actually Chris and David, who was chief of staff of the IRA in the early 70s. He was from Donegal, I think, and he's the one who had an affair with Maria Maguire. And here he is. He died in 1991, long after he'd been prominent in the movement. And behind him is a large stone with a Celtic cross. You see the sun disc of various guys who were executed by hanging in Mountjoy jail, IRA men. And for part of the sentences and buried within the prison walls, and they were kept there, right? They remains there for ages. And then in 1999, it was decided that they would be dug up and reinterred, and so they were reburied here, and I can show you where that is. Well, they spoke to the relatives of the so-called Forgotten Ten, and their relatives were allowed to visit their graves, but after they execute people, they pour quicklime on, so the body just dissolves quite quickly. Anyway, so then one of the families, they said, no, we want to be buried in Ballylanders, I think in Tipperary, so he was. The other 9 were laid to rest here. And so they were given some sort of state funeral, military parade through the street, starting in O'Connell Street, and they're buried here. So that is them. So during that conflict, 1992-21, only 24 IRA men were executed. Bear in mind that easily 20,000 were arrested at some point or others, often interred in the Curragh or Ballykinlar, County Down. So they all could have been executed if convicted by a court-martial. Again, it shows how splendidly merciful the UK is, but there's no recognition of that. You think how other rebellions were dealt with at the time. Think of other irregular conflicts around that time, let's say in Spain, you know, socialist uprisings, or in northern Italy between fascists and communists, or the Rif Wars in Morocco, or how the Ottoman Empire dealt with rebellions, or let's say the Hungarian Red Terror and the White Terror. So these are the so-called Forgotten Ten. The Russian Civil War was going on at this time. The Mexican Civil War had been going on at this time. What Germany did in the countries occupied, such as Belgium, what the Austrians did when they occupied Serbia. So compared to that, the Crown was just incredibly merciful, the most merciful in the world. I'm not saying it was perfect. Yes, there was misconduct, sometimes grave misconduct. So sometimes honest mistakes were made, and innocent people were killed, and sometimes civilians were killed deliberately, and that is murder. If a member of the Crown Forces purposefully kills a civilian, knowing him not to be a threat, believing him or her not to be a threat, then yes, that is murder. So, but I think that happened very, very rarely indeed, considering the tens of thousands of members of the Crown Forces in Ireland back then. So obviously the Crown Forces record is not unblemished, but it's as about as good as you can get in the circumstances, especially for the time. Oh, and here's a memorial to Thomas Davis, who lies buried in Grange Gorman, a half-Welsh chap, born at Mallow, County Cork. His father's an army surgeon. So some of these guys, Patrick Pearse and so on, are partly Welsh, or Gerald Boland, born in Manchester. So, you know, people are always going about Pearse as Irish. I'm going to call him in English, because he was half English. He's born in Dublin, but he can be regarded as English as much as he is Irish. So this is going to be a corrective. Patrick Pearse was English. We've been hearing for over 100 years he was Irish, which he was, but let's balance it out a bit by calling him English, that Englishman. Or people used to say that about Erskine Childers, whom I don't think was born in England, or De Valera. Let's call him a Spanish American. He probably wasn't Spanish. Goodness knows who his father was. He's buried somewhere over there. Michael Collins is too. But you know, Collins has got this good reputation even amongst Republicans, but he was notorious for being so merciless. Even other IRA men said he's just got no compassion at all. So what saved his reputation was being killed on the 22nd of August 1922. Had he lived a bit later, the Civil War got rougher. No quarter. So the IRA were deliberately targeting civilians, as in politicians they didn't like. What's changed? And burning down civilian houses, and then the Free State Army was said we're going to execute people who are taken under arms. Trouble is, then why would you surrender? You're going to be killed anyway. Okay, only about 77 IRA men were killed by them, of easily 10,000 who were captured, so that's quite a small percentage. Anyway, so that's enough for me. So thank you so much for your donations. Please keep them coming. And remember, I'm a tour guide, and I teach history, English, literature, English language, French, politics, law, geography, religious studies. I translate from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German, and Russian. And I help you with your elocution, your theses and dissertations, essays, and so forth. Education consultancy. Okay, toodaloo.